I'm going to read for you a few scriptures. It comes from Genesis 32, verses 22 to the end. It is an interesting story, but I guess I should put it in context for you just a little bit. Jacob was one of twins. You remember that, don't you? Jacob and Esau were born together. They were not identical twins, they were fraternal twins. Esau came out and was covered with wonderful red hair, like I used to have. And he was the firstborn. He was supposed to get the blessing. And right behind him, even hanging on to his heel, it said, was Jacob, the secondborn. And they called him the grabber because he had a hold of his older brother's heel as he was being brought into the world. And so there was always this rivalry between Jacob and Esau. And at the time when that blessing was supposed to be given, you remember the story very well, Jacob, at his mother's suggestion, we're going to hold her at least partly responsible for being so creative, covered his arms and his neck and his shoulders with wool from the lamb, and covered himself so that he was as hairy as his brother Esau would be. Because old Isaac wasn't good, didn't have very good eyesight anymore, and so he was going to feel for that fuzzy, robust son of Esau before he gave the blessing. So Jacob came in, had fixed up some of Esau's game, fed his father, pranced around there, took care of some things, and then when it was time for the blessing, Isaac felt around to find the furry covering that he had put on him, and after his reservations were settled, gave Jacob Esau's blessing. As you might expect, if you've ever lived in a family with an older or younger brother or sister, it caused problems. Esau threatened to kill Jacob. And so Jacob took off and headed for the hills, ran away to save his life. Now he has 2 wives and several children and lots of cattle and lots of livestock, and he's heading back home to return. They're getting close to where Esau lives. Jacob's beginning to get nervous. He's beginning to wonder if Esau has still been waiting to fulfill his threat to kill him as soon as he got his hands on him. He decides to slip across a river and hide his family and his most cherished possessions away from Esau so they're not quite as vulnerable. And he goes into a season of prayer. He goes to the Lord in prayer. Verse 22, that night Jacob got up, took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And after he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called that place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near that tendon. I was reading people this morning, and Imogene said, "Aren't you cold? Short sleeve, shirts on?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm chilly. But I want to show off my scar. See that one? It goes from here to here, about that wide. Isn't that a beauty?" I had a melanoma showed up on my arm. It was just about the size of the end of an eraser on the end of a pencil. Tiny little thing. They said, "You have to have that thing removed. You have to get rid of it." So I went to the doctor, and she started sketching out what she was going to cut. And I thought, "Oh my goodness, you're about ready to take the whole lower part of my arm." She had this big magic marker thing on my skin, what she was going to do. And when she got done, I recalled a man I had out in Iowa who was my extremely good friend. He only had one arm. He'd lost this part of his arm, left arm, in an industrial accident. And he used to smile at me in that kind of knowing way that older gentlemen love to kind of coach younger guys. And he said, "Bob, just remember, every operation leaves a few scars. Every operation leaves a few scars." So I chose my short sleeve shirt today so that when you pass by, you can look at that beautiful, wonderful scar. I got another one back here, but I have to lift my arm to show you that one's kind of back here behind. Why would we talk about scars today? Precious scars. Because most of the time we think of scars as being ugly. You have any scars you wouldn't want to show anybody? Well, I mean, for other reasons than, they can be in strange places. Once had a lady in the hospital say, "Do you want to see my scar?" I said, "No, don't care." She was still under anesthetic. You don't want to do that. Scars aren't usually something we brag about. Because scars hurt. I got a scar right here in the middle of my lip. And every time I go out to shovel snow or chip away the ice or whatever it might be, my lip starts to throb. You know why? Because that scar doesn't have the same nerves in it that normal lip tissue has. And every time it starts to get cold, it goes and starts to freeze up on you because it doesn't have the blood vessels in it. And you can actually run your tongue on the inside of your upper lip and feel there's a cold spot in the middle of your lip. Scars are seldom considered precious. It just makes sense. Jacob went into a wrestling match with God's angel on that day and walked away with a permanent limp. He had a scar from wrestling with God. But our scars are often considered disfiguring. How many people have a child that they had to go to the doctor and have stitches for the first time? My dad took me to the doctor when I had to have 3 stitches. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm telling you about all my scars. No, it's 3 stitches, and he was the one crying. It was the first time somebody had to close up a wound on my young body. And it was him crying. We don't want to see our children disfigured and have to carry that. Still got it. It's right there. They can show weakness. There are scars that show where we once had ability that now it's disappeared. It's no longer the same as it was. We have been left weakened. There are scars that there's just no other way to say it. They look ugly to look at. You ever seen some of the people who've been through a fire? Yeah. Especially when you first get a sense of who they are almost repulsive in the look of them because the scars are not like normal. They're weird. Sometimes the scars that we carry are on the inside. They're emotional scars. There have been people in families, in schools, in different situations, even in churches, that have been wounded, and they have left themselves with scars. Scars that cause us to feel panic, anxiety. Have you ever felt like you couldn't get breath in your body? My daughter was talking about how they'd gone on vacation, and all of a sudden she came around the turn in the bend in the thing, and she saw her children, 3 children, lined up, sitting on what looked like a precipice of 1,000 feet, with their feet dangling over. And it's at Arches, the big national park where and they were just looking at the arches, sitting there on the side of the cliff. And suddenly she said, I couldn't get breath in my body. My children are going to fall off the mountain and die. And, well, that seemed realistic to me. You know, yeah, you don't want your kids dangling their feet over a cliff. But if you've been damaged by somebody you trusted and you believed in, suddenly you might feel fear even when there's nothing obvious out around you to cause that kind of panic. But it's because of that scar on the inside that all of a sudden you just lock up in the most incredible pain. A scar is left on the inside. And sometimes there's anger. How could somebody I trusted break my trust this way and say those things or do those things, and now I'm wounded and I don't know any way to make that go away. And we're left with a scar. Sometimes they're spiritual scars. And without going into extreme detail, they can leave us immobilized, paralyzed in our spiritual walk. Can you really trust God or not? Boy, if you want to talk about a fundamental question about your existence, that's a good one. Can you believe God will take care of you, or has He abandoned you when you needed Him most? And you leave scars. It changes who you are. And you say, I want to believe, but I just feel like my whole life is a charade because I hurt so badly on the inside, and I'm not effective in any kind of ministry because the internal conflicts rage in my mind and my heart, and I can't get settled so that I can speak any kind of words of truth or help or encouragement to somebody else because of this turmoil on the inside. They're spiritual scars. I want to tell you about precious scars. Can I make the scar go away? Not on your life. That thing is going to stay there every single day that I draw breath. And when they put me away for the last time, there'll probably be this one and a bunch more. And they'll be a part of who I am, what I was, and what I did. So how can you take the ugliness, the disability, the ineffectiveness, the paralysis, or the fear, or the anger, and how can you make that such a phrase that would say they're precious? How can you do that? Well, you have to understand the story of Jacob if you want to get that picture. Jacob was touched in the center of his hip, right in the center where the tendon holds the two bones together to make your leg allowed to operate. It holds the two bones. It's a very, very strong piece of tissue that bonds across a hip that moves this way, but it stays pulling the two pieces together. You follow? It has to be flexible enough to move. It has to be elastic enough to stretch a little bit as the bone works and moves, and you can lift your leg and extend. But if it extends too much, you become disabled. Jacob had that angel touch him in the center of his hip, and that strong tissue, that very powerful ligament, came out of position. And he was disabled from that point forward. How could that be a precious scar? Because in the process, he went from being a very human, failing person to being one who was willing to wrestle with God. And his whole identity changed. His whole identity was changed, not only his name. I had some people here, back in my earlier days that said, we had a lifestyle that we didn't like very much. So we decided we were just going to change our name. Officially, we were going to put away the names that we were given at birth, and we're going to take on a whole new identity. We're going to become a different name. Now that's pretty radical. But that's what happened when God changed Jacob's name from Jacob the grabber, the troublemaker, the instigator, the selfish, the greedy, to being one who wrestles with God and prevails. You see, Israel's covenant became entirely different following that moment. And so the remembrance of that event happens to be that every place he walked, every step he took, he walked with a limp, but as a new man. He walked with a limp and was disabled, but he was enabled by God's grace to do more than he ever could have been, because he now was Israel. The entire nation takes its name from a man who wrestled with God and was blessed by him. And you don't say, well, you guys are just a bunch of cripples. You're walking like Israel. No, but we have the identity of Israel. Israel took the scar in order to receive the blessing. And I think about others. I've got to go to this. I have to share with you. Paul in Acts 16, verses 22, is in Philippi, and he's been beaten. Now, if you go to that scripture and you read it, it's awfully easy to just say, okay, somebody took out their belt, like we do in school, or someone took the paddle and went after him. No, they took off his shirt, they took all of his clothes, and they took rods specifically designed to do damage to the tissue, and they slashed him and they beat him severely, both he and Silas, until they just about had opened up his entire back in welts and wounds inflicted by the rods, and then they put him in stocks in the inside of the prison and just let him suffer. We have this little phrase we use sometimes when we're laughing and say, ooh, that's going to leave a mark. Ooh, that's going to leave a mark. Yeah. I left a mark. Do you remember the pictures that we used to see back in the days when we were talking about the Civil War, of what the slaves looked like after they'd been flogged, after they'd been beaten? How do we know it was that bad? How do we know there were wounds that way? Well, a little later, down at verse 33, the Philippian jailer takes him to his home. And what's the first thing he does? He washes all their wounds and tries to purify them so they won't become infected and they'll be able to heal correctly. He takes the wounds that he is and the community has put upon his body, and he tries to do something to help them heal. It's a little late in the whole process. You shouldn't have put welts all over his backside anyway. He hadn't done anything except caused a man who had been crippled to be able to walk. There was no other offense that he could have been tried for. It's the only thing he did. Now, jump to Acts the 14th chapter, verses 19 through 20. He was at Lystra and had done nothing wrong. In fact, he had worked wonderful miracles to the point where the people thought he was a god who had come down to visit them. And suddenly some people who were against Paul and who were trying to stir up the crowds turned that adoring crowd around in an instantaneous, almost in a space of one verse, and they get him out. So they take him outside of town, and they pick up stones, and they pound him to the point with those stones that they know for sure he's dead. They look at him and say, "We have done our job. This man is now dead." Go across the road over there where we got a few stones. Grab a handful or two. Think what they would do. Think of the damage they'd do. They used big old stones. They were throwing at his head. They didn't care about hitting his legs. You don't kill a person knocking about on his legs. They want to go for the upper torso and the head, where it'll do the most damage. You want him dead. And out of the pile of rubble climbs a man, wounded in innumerable ways, and walks back into the city. Let me explain to you. When Paul got to Rome, when he finally got to the point where God had called him to be, when he walked through the gates to the Colosseum and stood before the emperor, Caesar, he was a wreck. I mean to tell you, that guy had been to war and had lost. Think of it. 5 times the Jews had put him to 40 lashes minus 1. 5 times they had lashed his body, 39 lashes. 3 times he was beaten with rods. 1 time stoned to the point of death. 3 times shipwrecked. And oh, by the way, that was written before he actually had that 14-day hurricane. That 14 days in the storm, thrashed and beat about. He stands before the Caesar, saying, "The only crime I've committed is I told the story of what Jesus did for me. The only crime I've committed is I told the truth about who Jesus Christ is. And this is what I have to show for it." Do you think he took off his robes? Do you think he showed him his back? Do you think he showed them the back of his legs where he'd been whipped? No, he didn't have to. That wasn't appropriate in that society. The Secret Service agents, the inner core of the Caesar's own palace guard, had traveled with him through that 14-day hurricane. They'd seen every inch of his body. They knew exactly what he looked like. They knew every one of his scars. They could testify to what it was like. Something to be avoided, something to be hidden, something to be covered up? Not really. Let me explain. Paul would have been executed on the spot just to get rid of him if he had not worn those scars. How do we know that? They killed Jesus and he had no visible sign of being a criminal, a lawbreaker, someone that had to be put away from society in order to keep things together. They just killed him right off the cuff. After one trial, they put him on the cross, and that was it. Paul was standing before the emperor of the entire world. If he had not had the obvious marks that he had carried from all of the abuse that he'd received for doing nothing but telling the story of Jesus, they would have laughed him off the platform and crucified him too, or otherwise. The only reason his ministry was able to be spoken out in front of every person of note in the entire Roman world, filling that Colosseum, was because of the wounds that he had accepted in his body. How does that relate to you and I? Whatever wound you might have had, either from family, from friends, from people in church, in whatever situation you might have been, in school or whatever situation, you say, but I'm wounded, I've got these scars, I can't function. No. If we let God work the miracle that he intends to do in us, if we give him a chance to take what we have received and make it useful in his service, to let the testimony of his grace and his power and his authority reach into our community, our scars become the very thing that make us most effective. Our scars are our creds. You know, you talk about having street cred. You gotta have something that's real, that's tangible. If you've been wounded, if you've been hurt, if you have had suffering, God doesn't just leave you with the wounds without any meaning. He says, turn them over to me. Let my Spirit change those ugly things into something that testify to my grace. And people who are equally wounded, who have been hurt just as deeply, will know that they can trust him too. Jesus Christ went to the cross, and it says when he resurrected on Easter Sunday morning and came to visit with his disciples that evening, he did a very important thing. He did something shocking in some ways, gross in other ways, and just strange. He held out his hands and he said, see, it's real. It's just me. He said, see, it's me. It's real. I'm here. See where the spear went in? It's me. When Thomas said, you can never convince me that he is alive. You will never convince me until I put my fingers in those spots and thrust my hand in his side. He was saying, what you are telling me is impossible. And Jesus said, Thomas, come over here. Thomas, I got good news for you. Thomas, here you go, buddy. The scars were the reason he knew it was real. If somewhere in your heart you say, but not my scars. My scars just hurt. My scars just disable me. Give Jesus Christ a chance to turn your scars into instruments of effective ministry. Let me explain it another way. Paul loves to talk about soldiers. If you read much of Paul, you're going to find out he loves to talk about military. He likes to talk about athletics too, but he also likes to talk about soldiers. And one of the things that happens is every time a soldier goes into battle and he goes to engage, he knows that he could sometimes come out with wounds. He might sometimes have to suffer, recuperate. And he knows that every time he goes into battle, he might even die. But when he returns, they give him a medal, and a part of that medal is, right at the very top of it, is a little ribbon. All right? Colorful ribbon. Every battle has a different pattern, and they pin those on his uniform. You know anybody in the military had a Purple Heart? I didn't get a Purple Heart. I got a good conduct, but they were stretching the terms when they gave me that. The more battles you've been in, the more bars you have on your uniform. And if you've been in the military very long, pretty soon that gets to be a pretty impressive pile of ribbons on the front of your chest. You know why? Because every battle you're in leaves you a little different than you went into that battle. Every operation leaves a few scars. Ask anybody that came back from Vietnam or Iraq, Afghanistan. And the only thing you have to show for it, besides your scars, is that ribbon that says, I did it. For God and country, I did it. Does that make the scars go away? No. Does that make the pain you have to go through go away? No. Does that make it so that you don't have to wake up with nightmares? No. That stuff stays. That's real. But it had a purpose. It was done for a reason. It was to accomplish something positive. It was to do something that helped the world. It was something you invested yourself in to be able to make this a place that you can have family and friends and loved ones, and they're okay. Does that mean you won't hurt? No. But you know what it was for. Jesus Christ says, nothing happened to you that I did not know. Nothing happened to you that I did not understand what you were going through. And I tell you now, there's nothing you've gone through that I cannot make into a badge of courage. A badge of honor. A badge to be proud of. That you've survived it and you've gone through it and you have become victorious. That's when those disfiguring scars become precious. Because ultimately, if we can't say to our loved ones, you can have confidence in my Lord and Savior Jesus. See what He has done? See how He has turned the sorrows of my life into meaningful ministry and joy? See how He has taken what otherwise would have killed me and made me stronger? See how He's using this to reach many more people with the good news? If you're here, scarred, battered, bruised, beat up, you're never going to get as badly beat up as Paul was. Not many of us will ever see the nails like Jesus did. Few of us are going to get stoned, even fewer crucified. But even those small wounds can be used to glorify our Father in heaven if we simply ask that He would come in and take us. If you need to pray, if there's something that's been bothering you and you just don't know how to get rid of it, the altar is going to be open here. I want you to understand this is something you don't have to carry alone. If it's something that's been working you to the point where it's paralyzed you and you don't know how to deal with it, there is help available at the cross. And we'll pray with you, we'll work with you, we'll do whatever we can to take care of you. As the praise team comes forward, we're going to sing our last song. But I want you to understand, God doesn't leave you wounded for no purpose. He wants to use what has happened in your life to bless people who surround you every day. You just don't know what they're hurting about. Let Him do that for you. Come and share if you need to. Would you stand, please? Jamie, lead us.
Many times I've tried and tested as I travel day by day. I'll find me with pain and sorrow, and there's trouble in the way. But I have the sweet assurance that my soul the Lord will lead, and in Him there is strength for every need. Oh, His grace is sufficient for me, and His love is abundant and free. And what joy fills my soul just to know that His grace is sufficient for me. When the tempter brings confusion and I don't know what to do, on my knees I turn to Jesus, for I know He'll see me through. Then despair is changed to victory. Every doubt just melts away, and in Him there is hope for every day. Oh, His grace is sufficient for me, and His love is abundant and free. And what joy fills my soul just to know that His grace is sufficient for me. Oh, what joy fills my soul just to know that His grace is sufficient for me.
Father in heaven, you know your flock. Your precious lambs are under your care. And on every single wound you put your anointing oil, the spirit of comfort on each and every one. And whatever has been the wound, no matter how deep or how painful or how festered it might have been, you have the power in your hands to take that wounded lamb and make it whole.
We ask, Lord, that in the power of your strength, of your divine presence, you will breathe into each heart to say, I know what you've been through. I know how bad it hurt. I know I've been there. Remember, I was there. My wounds let you know that your wounds are understood. And my eyes are filled with tears for what you had to suffer. But I have come that you might have grace and life, abundant and full. Lord, let the healing come. Let the rain of your Spirit wash away all the sorrow. Let the grief and the fear be purged away from every heart. Let the wounds become badges of honor that we have endured, and we can praise your name because of every circumstance of life, whether it was the most joyful or the most painful. We give you the honor and the glory in everything.